Sanctions don't work? The key word of the past year naturally became war. However, the word sanctions almost made it into the top 10 most popular words and phrases. They rained down on Russia, which unleashed a war in neighboring Ukraine, as it from an abundance horn. Today, the aggressor country holds the ignoble first place in the number of sanctions imposed against it. Today, Russia subjected to over 14,000 international restrictions. Meanwhile, sanction-stricken countries such as Iran, North Korea, Syria, Myanmar, Venezuela and Cuba collectively have about 10,000 restrictions. And yet, aforementioned countries have years of experience with sanctions, whereas Russia's sanctions history is only 9 years old. Moscow faced restrictions in 2014 after occupation of Crimea. Where did the practice of sanctions policy originate? Who invented sanctions and when were they previously used? How do they work? Which countries have been subjected of sanctions and for what reasons, and how do they function under them? Is it true that sanctions can halt Russian aggression? Let's delve into these questions. How sanctions have impacted small countries and entire empire is poignant tale. The history of sanctions dates back to ancient times. The first recorded instance of economic sanctions as documented and written source can be traced to Athens, imposing them on the city Megara. A member of the Peloponnesian League, dissatisfied with the fact that numerous runaway Athenian slaves found refuge in Megara, Athens declared a maritime blockade against the city. During medieval Europe, a notable example of comprehensive sanctions can be observed in the prohibition imposed by the Roman popes from the 20th century onwards. The sanctions targeted Christian trade with Jews, Muslims, heretics, and their impact was particularly significant on trade routes in the Mediterranean. In the medieval period, the dynamics of military and political alliances changed frequently, leading to localized and short-lived sanctions. However, it was during the era that the Spanish word embargo became a part of English vocabulary. In the later half of the 16th century, Spain imposed embargoes on England and its goods as a retaliatory measure against Queen Elizabeth I. This action was prompted by her astute operating involving the confiscation of Spanish gold. Moving to the 19th century, maritime blockades became the primary instrument of sanctions and restrictions. Thus, measures aimed to prevent a country from engaging in maritime trade with other nations without declaring war. In the 19th century, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to impose truly massive sanctions against Great Britain. In 1806, he issued the Decree of the Continental Blockade. No ship was allowed to enter ports in France or its controlled territories if it was bound for England. It is worth nothing that at that time virtually all of Europe was under the influence of France. Trade and communication with British possessions were also prohibited. Under the pressure of Napoleon, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia joined the sanctions. However, the primary objective of crippling the British economy was not achieved. Napoleon couldn't enforce strict compliance with the blockade's conditions by all his allies and satellites. And Russia's violation of the blockade became one of the reasons for the War of 1812. The true era of sanctions began in the 20th century with the rapid development of international trade relations, prior to the start of World War II. Sanctions were imposed on countries such as Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, and Paraguay. During the Cold War, sanctions were not particularly effective as they were often not supported by either the Western or Eastern Bloc countries, with the United States and the Soviet Union as their respective leaders. A vivid example of this is the US sanctions against Cuba. For many decades, the economy of the island nation relied solely on support from the Soviet Union. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet system and the cessation of aid that the situation in Cuba deteriorated to the point where the country's leadership began timid attempts at societal democratization. However, the US sanction against Cuba can still be considered the most well-known sanctions of the 20th century. They were the longest-lasting in the world history, with one of the last remaining socialist regimes experiencing almost complete isolation for 63 years. It all began on a hot day in August 1960, when a massive crowd gathered at Plaza de la Revolución in Havana to listen to their young leader Fidel Castro.
Los que creyeron que después de nuestras victorias militares nos iban a aplastar en el campo de la información, nos iban a aplastar en el campo de la opinión pública, se han encontrado.
While rallies and speeches by Cuban revolution leader were common at that time, the emotionally charged speech delivered by Castro forever divided Cuba's history into before and after. The speech was about nationalization of American-owned companies that controlled all vital sectors of the Cuban economy, from sugar production to passenger shipping. Furthermore, the Comandante issued a decree to nationalize the property of American citizens who owned homes or land in Cuba. The reaction from the United States was swift. The sanctions then came crashing down like an avalanche, prohibition on the sale of trucks, jeeps, and spare parts. Embargo on the supply of any goods, with the exception of the medicine and food. Diplomatic relations were severed. And finally, a complete trade blockade was imposed by Kennedy in 1962. Moreover, under pressure from the United States, the Organization of American States joined the embargo against the island, comprising 35 countries in the Americas. Cuba found itself cut off from all trade routes, and the snowball of sanctions continued to roll. In 1966, US citizens were prohibited from visiting the island without special permits, which were not easily obtained. There was accountability for cooperation with any Cuban companies and organizations. In the early 1980s, the country was declared a sponsor of terrorism. How did those restrictions impact Cuba? They led to strong negative consequences for the Cuban economy and population. As a result of the trade embargo and financial restrictions, Cuba faced shortages of food and essential goods and services. For nearly 30 years after the imposition of sanctions, the Cuban economy relied only on its elder brother, the Soviet Union, which provided economic, financial, and political support. However, with the onset of perestroika, this became impossible as the Soviet Union faced its own problems, which ultimately led to its collapse along with the entire socialist bloc. The damage caused by sanctions against Cuba is evaluated differently by politicians, economists, and other specialists. However, it is a staggering figure. According to the Cuban authorities, the direct harm from the Cuban blockade amounted to around $1 trillion in current prices. On the morning of October 9, the year 2006, a powerful explosion from the North Korean Panagari test site, followed by underground tremors measuring up to 4 on the Richter scale, reverberating across the Korean peninsula. Within minutes, the media was abuzz with one topic: North Korea had successfully tested its first nuclear bomb. Politicians and the public in many countries were outraged. Within a few hours, a proposal for sanctions against North Korea reached the United Nations Security Council, and since then, for the following 17 years, UN resolution increasingly isolated the DPRK from the outside world, creating economic challenge for the country. The UN Security Council imposed a complete ban on the supply of aviation and missile fuel, liquefied natural gas, iron, steel, industrial equipment, and means of air, land, and sea transportation. The sale of oil and petroleum productions to North Korea was severely restricted, and investments and joint ventures were prohibited. North Korea was also prohibited from trading in minerals, metals, foodstuffs, textiles, and other goods. In effect, the sanctions severed North Korea from the global financial and banking system. Certain goods were prohibited from being exported to North Korea as part of the sanctions. This resulted in North Korea facing shortages of goods and medical supplies. To ensure the population had access to essential goods, the North Korean authorities implemented a rationing system known as the CAR system, which, according to the United Nations estimates, covers more than half of the population.
우리 수백만 당원 동지들이 애국 충성의 심장을 불태우며
The official ideology of North Korea, Chushe, emphasized self-reliance in all spheres, including the economy. However, in reality, North Korea heavily relies on fuel supplies, technology, transportation means, and many other imports from abroad. Cuba and North Korea serve as a vivid example of how sanctions can lead to the economic collapse of a major country and push its population into poverty. A more recent example can be seen in Venezuela. Not long ago, in the early 21st century, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America. However, it is currently grappling with the strong consequences of the most devastating economic crisis in its history. Sanctions played a crucial role in its crisis, imposed in response to Hugo Chávez's decision to nationalize foreign extraction companies. The combination of harsh restrictions and the economic crisis has brought this once prosperous nation to the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Iran, to a lesser extent than Cuba, has also been under an economic blockade for quite some time. On January 8, the year 1978, if the sacred Iranian city of Qom, the first anti-government demonstration took place, and within a year the Shah was overthrown, and Iran became an Islamic republic. Tired of social injustice and police brutality, the Iranians exchanged a Western-oriented secular monarchy for the rule of the Muslim clergy. However, the choice also meant political and economic isolation. The Ayatollah regime's fight against Zionism, American imperialism, and its sunny neighbors became the ideological foundation of the new political system. The country's leadership began sponsoring Islamic political movements throughout the Middle East, some of which were involved in acts of terrorism. Iran was labeled a state sponsor of terrorism. The course taken by Iran was perceived as a threat to stability in a region crucial to the interests of the United States and Europe, providing justification for the imposition of stringent economic sanctions. For over 40 years, the Iranian people have been living under strictest sanctions. Iranian assets were frozen in major American and European banks. Total embargo prevents Iran from exporting oil and thereby deprives the country of crucial foreign currency revenue needed for importing resources and technologies. Loss in oil exports has cost the country over $100 billion. Among other negative consequences of the sanctions is the withdrawal of major international players from the Iranian market. The previously rapidly developing country has entered a period of recession. Sanctions have dealt a huge blow to Iran. For instance, being disconnected from the global financial system and cut off from SWIFT forced the use of an outdated system. This has resulted in financial transactions taking longer and being more expensive, while access for Iranians to many goods and services has been hindered. Economic sanctions have had a detrimental impact on Iranian people. Significant inflation has led to rising prices, worsening the financial situation. Unemployment rates in Iran are among the highest in North Africa and the Middle East. The ban on importing advanced medicines has affected patients, particularly those suffering from serious illnesses. In an attempt to alleviate the growing social tension, the government has resorted to the subsidies and providing social goods at low prices. However, significant social expenditures fuel inflation and hinder economic growth. Experts predict a worsening economic situation in Iran. The authorities are periodically forced to resort to printing money, fearing protests. Also, the cause of last year's mass protests was not only solely economic. Those dissatisfied with the economic situation are always eager to join the protestants. Sanctions are not a quick matter. As we can see from examples of other countries, they don't work fast, but they certainly take their toll. It's appropriate to recall a Chinese wisdom: sit by the river long enough, and the bodies of your enemies will float by. The economic strangulation of the USSR by sanction also lasted for decades and eventually yielded results. The well-known Jackson-Vanik Amendment was introduced as early as 1974. This amendment to the U.S. Trade Act restricted trade with countries that hindered emigration and violated other human rights. While trade restrictions naturally couldn't change the existing regime in the USSR, they became a symbolic representation of sanctions against the evil empire. But despite these first imposed sanctions, the 1970s was the growth of illusory well-being in the Soviet Union. Well-being bought for oil. The increase in the price of it made it possible to buy stability and relative prosperity within the country and the influence of the USSR on the world stage. However, the abundance of oil at that time made Moscow less cautious, leading to the Afghanistan conflict. It is clear that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marked a turning point in Soviet-American relations. It was perceived as a de facto abandonment of the policy of peaceful coexistence. It was decided that it was impossible to negotiate with the Moscow regime and that a change was needed. Drawing parallels with the present day and the war unleashed by Russia in Ukraine is inevitable. The oil abundance of the 2000s was also acquired with petrodollars. Similarly, the war has become the defining factor that condemned Russia to years of isolation and sanctions in all spheres. Immediately after the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan, US President Carter announced sanctions against the USSR. Those included embargo on grain sales, a ban on the sale of advanced technology, bilateral reduction of diplomatic personnel, and more. By the way, it was during this time that the planned opening of the American consulate in Kyiv did not take place. Carter also declared the curtailing of scientific, culture, and trade economic ties with the Soviet Union. Of all the measures listed, the embargo on grain sales, which the USSR desperately needed, was perhaps the most significant. In the long term, the ban on exporting high technology became the most sensitive issue, as Western European countries and Japan also joined in imposing restrictions. Without access to high technologies, the country wasn't unable to develop not only its economy but also significantly lagged behind in military and defense developments. One of the most prominent symbolic acts of sanction was the Western boycott of the 1980s Olympic Games in Moscow. The catastrophe of the passenger Boeing 747, shot down by a Soviet fighter, not only heightened international tensions but also led to new sanctions against the USSR. The current storm of sanctions restrictions began in February 2022 and shows no signs of abating. 10 packages of sanctions have already been imposed, with an 11th one in the works. Such a scale of sanctions has never been seen in history. From the prohibition of Russian aviation flights to restrictions in the culture sphere and bans on athlete performances, those sanctions have affected the financial, energy, transportation, and technological sectors, while also impacting visa policies and the ability of Russians to obtain permanent residency in other countries and travel freely around the world. Russian assets have been frozen abroad, and personal sanctions have been imposed on the President of Russia, his inner circle friends, top officials, influential businessmen, and public figures who openly supported the aggressive war. Impressive is also the list of countries that have joined those sanctions or have prohibited their circumvention. Sanctions lead to reduced investments, restricted international trade, and difficulties for businesses. For instance, since the start of the war, Russia hasn't produced a single aircraft. The inability to undergo technical maintenance due to imposed sanctions has led Aeroflot to send planes for repair in Iran.
در همین راستا در طی اقدامات اخیر این مرکز میزبان یک فروند هواپیمای ایرباس 330 خطوط هوایی یکی از قطب‌های سیاسی و اقتصادی دنیا.
Let's be clear, this option is no less risky than repairing them domestically. No matter how much the propagandists on television screens boast about the benefits of living under sanctions. They increasingly exert a negative impact on Russian citizens. In the face of growing economic difficulties, the standard of living inevitably declines. Rising prices of goods and services, job cuts, and increasing unemployment all exert significant pressure on the country's population. Russian television can show a freezing and starving Europe as much as it wants, where people bath once a month and sleep in fur coats. In reality, of course, things are not like that. And even with a slight decline in the standard of living as a result of the war, the average European, in fact, lives much better than average Russian. Although, it seems that thanks to Russian television, Russians think otherwise. Can sanctions influence the war and compel Russia to end it? And what other restrictions are needed? Both Ukrainian and foreign experts and analysts believe that sanctions will not threaten the dictatorial regime in the next 1 or 2 years. Sanctions and restrictions will not directly stop the war. However, they will critically impact the long-term quality of life for Russians for 10 years or more. Let's not forget that Russia has been preparing for this war for many years, accumulating resilience. Record high prices for energy resources in 2022 paved its economy even with reduced sales and lost markets. However, in the near future, they will push the country towards an economic abyss, setting a price ceiling on Russian oil. Abandoning gas, coal and petroleum products have already brought and continue to bring significant losses to the country, which will affect the well-being of the entire country, including gas stations that derive their main income from the sale of energy resource. Summing up everything mentioned today, it can be said that sanctions against Russia are effective. Not as quick as many would like, but in the long run, they will crash the aggressor's economy. Therefore, restrictions should be strengthened and new ones imposed. Even though Putin remains in power and continues the senseless war, sanctions provide real assistance to Ukraine. If it were not for the economic damage they inflict on Russia, it would be shelling Ukrainian cities not once a month with a salvo of 20 rockets, as it currently does, but with a salvo of 100 rockets every week, as it was at the beginning of the war. And this would directly impact the situation on the front lines. Sanctions against the Russian Federation have a noticeable impact on the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. This is a belief of American diplomat James O'Brien. He also added that the United States and its allies intend to tighten the screws of sanctions against Russia until Ukraine achieves a complete victory. But Russia is a country with immense resources and a population willing to obediently follow the leaders, even those leading them to slaughter. Sanctions couldn't swiftly end Russia's economy. However, they continue to work to weaken the country, and no one knows when they will achieve their goal. Sooner or later, it will happen. Therefore, it is too early to put an end to the sanctions war. What lies ahead for Russia? Let's leave that question unanswered for now. Soon we will see it all for ourselves. To be continued.